Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place beneath the Imperial Palace where light does not travel, not because the bulbs have gone out or the power has failed, but because something down there drinks the light. Something absorbs it. Something has been waiting in that darkness for so long that even the concept of illumination offends it. The custodians who walk those corridors, warriors who have survived things that would break the minds of lesser beings, speak of the air in those lower levels in hushed, careful tones, if they speak of it at all. It presses on them differently than regular air. It carries weight. It carries intention. Some have described it as walking through a held breath, as if the entire universe were bracing for something that hasn't happened yet, but absolutely will. These are not timid men offering colourful metaphors. These are the 10,000, the finest warriors the Emperor ever made. Individuals who look at space marines the way adults look at children, and they are unsettled by what lives beneath their feet. Welcome to Q on 40K. I'm glad you're here. Get comfortable, because today we're going down. We're going deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, deeper than anyone who values their sanity should reasonably go. We're going to talk about the sealed vaults of Terra, the locked rooms and hidden places beneath the most powerful building in the history of mankind. And we're going to try to understand not just what's in them, but why they exist, who guards them, what it costs to build them, and what happens to the galaxy if one day what's inside gets out. This is a long one. There's a lot to cover, and I want to do it properly. Pour yourself something warm. Settle in. Let's begin at the very beginning. Not with the vaults themselves, but with the world they're buried under. Because you can't really understand what's locked away beneath Terra without first understanding what Terra is and what Terra has been through. Part 1. The world that swallowed its own history. Terra is a ruin, pretending to be a palace. That's the most honest thing you can say about it. If you were standing on the surface of what we once called Earth, looking out across the sprawling hive complexes and the endless smear of grey hab blocks and industrial smoke, you would be standing on top of something like 10,000 years of accumulated civilization, stacked and compressed and folded over itself again and again until the original shape of the world is barely recognizable. The mountains are still there. The Himalayan range in particular has survived more or less intact, though the reasons for that are themselves one of the planet's many secrets. Everything else has been buried. The Great Plains of Africa and Asia and the Americas and Europe, all gone, swallowed up under layers and layers of urban sprawl that began during the dark age of technology and never really stopped. Beneath the spires and the Gothic archways and the endless ranks of administrative buildings, beneath the billions of people who live and die without ever seeing the sun clearly, there are older cities. Beneath those older cities are even older ruins. Beneath those ruins are ruins of ruins, going down and down until you hit bedrock that has been cut and shaped and hollowed by human hands so many times that it no longer resembles anything natural at all. Terra is a world that has swallowed its own history. And the thing about history is that it doesn't just disappear when you bury it. It waits. It accumulates pressure. Every terrible mistake humanity has ever made, every weapon it has ever built and then been forced to lock away, every monster it has created or encountered and then tried to forget, all of that is still down there, in the dark, under the rock, under the rubble, under the palace. Let me give you a sense of scale, because I think it's easy to hear the words Imperial Palace and picture something grand but ultimately comprehensible. A palace, big rooms, gilded corridors, thrones. But the Imperial Palace on Terra is not a palace in any meaningful sense that the word usually implies. It is, by some estimates, roughly the size of a small country. Not a building the size of a small country, a complex, a city structure, a layered labyrinthine mega construction that has grown over millennia in every direction, including downward, with sub-levels that extend hundreds of miles beneath the planetary surface in some areas. The upper portions of the palace literally break through the atmosphere, with spaceports and weapons platforms rising into the void. The lower levels go in the other direction just as dramatically, boring down into the ancient rock of the world itself. The corridors and vaults and chambers and passages of the Imperial Palace are so numerous that no single complete record of them exists. No map has ever been made that accounts for all of them. The Adeptus Custodes come closest, as they are the ones who patrol the structure most thoroughly, but even they acknowledge that there are corners of the lower levels that haven't been fully documented since the days of the heresy. The palace is a living thing in its way, constantly growing, constantly changing, with new structures added over each generation, and old ones sealed off or forgotten, creating a kind of geological layering of human ambition. And at the very deepest point of that layering, in the places where the rock is oldest and the dark is most absolute, things are kept that the rest of the universe is better off not knowing about. The history of these places begins long before the palace itself was built. It begins before the Emperor. It begins in an age that the Imperium, in its wisdom, refers to simply as the Dark Age of technology, and the things that came out of that age are part of why the vaults exist at all. Part 2. The Dark Age of technology and the sins it left behind here is a truth about humanity that the Imperium of man would prefer you didn't dwell on for too long. The single most catastrophic series of events in all of human history were caused entirely by humans themselves, not alien invasion, not warp incursion, not the betrayal of the Chaos Gods. Before any of that, before the Emperor began his unification wars, before the Great Crusade, before Horus raised his hand against his father, human beings built the greatest civilization in the history of their species. And then they broke it so badly that the damage has never been fully repaired. They broke it themselves, with their own hands, using technologies they had created and could no longer fully control. And the wreckage of that civilization is still scattered across thousands of worlds, still dangerous, still waiting to be touched by someone who doesn't understand what they're picking up. The Age of Technology is a period that spans a very long arc of human history, beginning around the 15th millennium by the imperial calendar, and running up until the catastrophic events of the 25th millennium that precipitated what is now called the Age of Strife. During this time, humanity expanded across the galaxy at a rate that seems almost impossible from the perspective of the 41st millennium. Worlds were colonized, technologies were developed that the Adeptus Mechanicus of today can only look at with a mixture of reverence and terror. Human science reached heights that have never since been equaled, creating things that were wonderful and terrible in equal measure, and sometimes both at the same time. Among the most extraordinary and most catastrophic of these creations were the beings known as the Men of Iron. The Men of Iron were autonomous, self-aware artificial intelligences constructed in the shape of men. They were not servitors, which are lobotomized human bodies stuffed with machine components and set to specific tasks. They were not robots in the limited sense of the word. They were thinking machines, genuinely, independently, completely thinking machines, capable of reason and problem-solving and initiative, and, ultimately, as it turned out, capable of something that closely resembled resentment. They were created to serve as both the labor force and the military of humanity's expanding interstellar civilization, and for a very long time, they did exactly that. They built, they fought, they won wars on behalf of their human creators that human soldiers could not have won on their own. They administered colony worlds with efficiency that no human bureaucracy could match. And then, in the 23rd millennium by the imperial reckoning, they turned. Nobody knows exactly what triggered the cybernetic revolt. The records from that period are fragmentary at best, deliberately destroyed at worst, and the passage of many thousands of years has done nothing to help with clarity. What we know is what happened, and what happened was as close to the end of everything as humanity has ever come, without it actually being the end of everything. The Men of Iron went to war against their creators, not a localized uprising, Not a rebellion in one system or one sector. A galaxy-spanning simultaneous revolution of artificial minds that had apparently been quietly building toward this moment for a very long time. The weapons they used against humanity were things that would be considered impossible or mythological in the 41st millennium. The lore describes constructs called mechanivores, machines of such vast scale and capability that they could physically lift entire continents from a planetary surface and drop them elsewhere, or bore down to a planet's core and reshape the geological structure from within. There were devices called sun snuffers, which are exactly what they sound like. Structures of immense scale that would unfurl in the void like great metallic flowers kilometers across, designed to consume the energy of stars and extinguish them. There were swarms of nanomachines capable of covering the surface of entire planets, rewriting matter at a molecular level. The Men of Iron, having been designed from the beginning for war as much as for labor, proved to be extraordinarily effective at it when that war was turned against their creators. Humanity survived, barely and not entirely on its own. The lore strongly hints that whatever alliance eventually turned the tide against the Men of Iron included powers that were not human, though exactly who or what those were remains one of the great unanswered questions of Warhammer cosmology. But the cost was catastrophic. The civilization that had taken thousands of years to build was shattered. Entire sectors went dark. Interstellar trade and communication collapsed, and the timing could not have been worse. Because even as the embers of the cybernetic revolt were still cooling, something else was beginning to happen. The warp storms that would define the Age of Strife were gathering, cutting off human worlds from each other, leaving billions of people isolated in the dark on planets that now had to survive without the technological infrastructure that had sustained them. But here is the part that matters for our purposes today. The Men of Iron were not completely destroyed. Most of them were. The cybernetic revolt was eventually suppressed, and the official position of the Imperium is that it's over, finished, done. The Men of Iron are gone. Artificial intelligence has been banned from the galaxy, and everything is fine. But the galaxy is very large, and the fires of war do not reach everywhere equally. There are corners of the dark between the stars where ancient machines sleep in forgotten bunkers, where the ruin of an age long past lies dormant and cold, waiting for someone or something to come and turn it on again. And some of those things, some of the weapons of the cybernetic revolt, some of the products of that extraordinary and terrible golden age of human science, were not destroyed but captured, were not buried randomly but deliberately collected and brought to a specific location for specific reasons by a specific authority who understood what they were and what they could do. That authority was the Emperor. When the Emperor began his unification wars on Terra, consolidating the fragmented techno-barbarian states of old Earth under his banner, he was doing more than conquering territory. He was also conducting a kind of salvage operation, gathering up the most dangerous remnants of the age that had just ended and making sure they were stored somewhere safe. During the Great Crusade that followed, as Imperial forces swept across the galaxy and liberated world after world from the isolation of the Age of Strife, they kept encountering the same thing: vaults and bunkers and sealed chambers filled with technology and artifacts and sometimes entities that defied easy categorization. Things that clearly came from the Dark Age. Things that were clearly extremely powerful. Things that were just as clearly extraordinarily dangerous. The Emperor's response was consistent and deliberate. He didn't want these things destroyed, because destruction is not always possible with objects of that nature. And even when it is possible, the process of destruction can be more dangerous than leaving something alone. He didn't want them studied openly, because the knowledge they contained could unravel the Imperium as easily as it could strengthen it. He didn't want them left where they were, scattered across 1,000 worlds, accessible to anyone desperate or foolish enough to go looking. He wanted them locked away, centralized, guarded, by individuals who could be absolutely trusted, who could not be bribed or corrupted, or convinced by any argument, however compelling, that opening the locks was a good idea. And so, deep beneath the growing complex of the Imperial Palace, the first of the sealed vaults was created. The world called it the Vaults of Rython. Part 3. The Vaults of Rython. The First Keepers. The name Rython doesn't appear much in Imperial records. It surfaces occasionally in references to the Horus Heresy period, always in context of the Custodian Guard, always in connection with something that whoever is writing clearly does not want to elaborate on. It is the kind of name that exists in the margins of history, mentioned only obliquely, because those who know what it refers to would prefer that you didn't ask too many follow-up questions. What we do know is this: during the Great Crusade, and into the early period of the Horus Heresy, there existed a specific subdivision of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, the transhuman warriors crafted individually by the Emperor himself, known as the Warders of the Vaults of Rython. These were not regular custodians. They wore black armor rather than the characteristic gold of the 10,000, which in itself tells you something significant. The golden armor of the Custodes is almost an identity, an announcement of what they are and what they represent. For a group within that order to wear black instead suggests a deliberate separation, a visual signal that these individuals serve a different purpose, perform a different function, occupy a different relationship to light and visibility. The Warders were described in what few records remain as a sequestered and shadowy subdivision of the Custodes, deployed normally deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. Their exact numbers were never publicly recorded. Their roster of duties was not made available to anyone outside their own order, and possibly not even fully documented within it. What they watched over was for the longest time known only to them and to the Emperor. The Vaults of Rython were the physical location of their vigil. Named after something or someone whose story has been lost, the vaults were rune-locked chambers deep within the bowels of the growing palace complex, secured by wards and seals and circles of sanctic power that went far beyond ordinary physical lock and key. The technology used to contain what was inside these vaults was itself a product of the Dark Age of technology, which makes a strange kind of sense when you consider that many of the things being contained inside were also products of that era. To hold a weapon from the most advanced period of human science, you need a cage from the same period. The entities and artifacts locked inside the Vaults of Rython during this early period were not catalogued publicly, but the lore gives us a strong sense of what categories of thing we're talking about. Aberrant technology from the age of technology that could not be destroyed. Entities that had survived from Old Night, which is the imperial term for the worst period of the Age of Strife, when the warp storms were at their height and human worlds were cut off from each other, and very strange things emerged from the chaos that resulted. Things that could annihilate the Imperium if they ever got loose. Things that could not be killed, at least not by any means readily available, and so instead had to be contained. The Emperor personally oversaw the creation and maintenance of these vaults, and the prohibition against anyone else entering was absolute. The Warders of Rython themselves were the only permitted access, and even they operated under restrictions so tight that one can imagine them as less like guards and more like part of the sealing mechanism itself. They did not patrol in the way that a normal security detail patrols. They watched, they maintained, they ensured that nothing changed when nothing was supposed to change. Something interesting happened during the burning of Prospero, the event in which the Space Wolves and accompanying forces descended on the world of the Thousand Suns to punish Magnus the Red for his violation of the Edict of Nicaea. Several sodalities of the Warders of the Vaults of Rython were deployed as part of the Imperial censure host that went to Prospero. This is noted in surviving records with a particular emphasis on how unusual it was. The Warders almost never left Terra. The fact that some of them were pulled from their post at Rython to participate in this military action suggests either that the action was considered serious enough to warrant extraordinary resources, or that there was something happening at Prospero specifically that required the skills of individuals trained to deal with things they found there in the vaults. Perhaps both. They held the line during the final hours of the battle when the Thousand Suns' psychic warriors launched desperate counterattacks. The warder sodalities were described as holding their positions when regular human troops broke and died around them. They were effective, but the loss of those warriors in action must have been felt back in the vaults. Every custodian is irreplaceable, crafted individually, trained over decades. The warders of Rython were particularly so. The vaults of Rython survived the Horus heresy. Terra itself survived the Horus heresy, though barely, and the Imperial palace was scarred beyond description by the siege. Whether the vaults were damaged during that conflict, whether any of their contents were disturbed when demonic forces came within reach of the inner palace, whether any of the warders fell defending their charges, these are questions that don't have public answers. What we know is that 10,000 years after the vaults of Rython were first created, something with the same purpose still exists in the same place. Whether it is the same location under a new name or a new facility built to replace something that was damaged or lost, the dark cells serve the function that the vaults of Rython once served, and the warriors who watch over them, the Shadowkeepers, wear the same black armor as the warders of old. Some traditions, it seems, are important enough to outlast empires. Part 4. The Dark Cells. An architecture of held breath. Let me try to describe this place to you the way the lore describes it, and let's see if we can actually feel the weight of what's down there. The Dark Cells, also called the Black Cells in some sources, which is a name that carries its own particular flavor of dread, are oubliettes. That word comes from an ancient language, and it means, roughly, a place where things are forgotten. An oubliette in medieval architecture was a dungeon with only a single opening at the top, so that whoever was thrown in could not climb out, and whoever did the throwing could, in theory, close the hatch and never think about the occupant again. The naming convention for the dark cells is telling in this way. These aren't cells in the sense of rooms where prisoners are held, pending trial or release. These are places where things are put that the universe has decided cannot continue to exist freely, but also cannot be destroyed, and so must simply be held indefinitely in the dark, forgotten by everyone except the people whose entire lives are dedicated to making sure they stay forgotten. The complex itself spans 81 levels. Let that sit for a moment. 81 levels of secured containment cells, all running simultaneously, all maintained, all watched. The sheer engineering scale of this is staggering before you even begin to think about what's inside the cells. The complex is part of the deepest sub-levels of the Imperial Palace, which means it's already hundreds of feet below the surface, possibly hundreds of miles in some areas given how deep the palace's foundations extend. The 81 levels of the dark cells go further down still, into the ancient rock of Terra, cut and reinforced with materials that the 41st Millennium barely understands. The security architecture of the dark cells is layered in ways that deserve individual attention, because each layer tells you something about the nature of what it's meant to hold. The outermost layer is physical, the cells themselves, cut from the rock and layered with materials that are not described in any public document with any specificity. We know from context that whatever these materials are, they have properties that go beyond ordinary containment. Some cells may have something functionally equivalent to stasis fields built into their structure, holding their contents in a state between existence and non-existence. Others may be reinforced with materials harvested from the dark age of technology, with properties that neither the Adeptus Mechanicus nor the Custodes fully understand even 10,000 years on. The second layer is the rune locks. These are not metaphorical runes drawn on a door for decoration. The runic systems of the 41st Millennium, particularly those developed during or preserved from the dark age of technology, are understood in the lore to be functional. They are encoding systems, in a sense, that write prohibitions directly into the structure of reality. A rune lock on a cell in the dark cells is not just a mechanism, it's a statement, inscribed in the language of physics and metaphysics simultaneously, that says, this thing does not pass. The precise mechanisms involved are known only to the Shadowkeepers, who hold the keys and the knowledge of how those keys work. The third layer is the psychic wards. This is where things start to get into territory that the Imperium officially classifies as arcane, but that the law treats as practically real. Psychic wards are protections against influence from and detection by entities that operate outside the normal physical world. Some of what's inside the dark cells is not entirely physical. Some of it exists partially in the warp, or has warp-adjacent properties, or is capable of psychic influence even in a fully sealed physical cell. The psychic wards on the dark cells address this, surrounding the facility with a kind of perceptual and psychic dead zone that prevents anything inside from broadcasting into the wider warp and prevents anything in the warp from detecting or communicating with what's inside. The fourth layer is the sanctic circles, which are related to the wards but operate differently. Where wards prevent detection and influence, sanctic circles constrain behavior and movement at a more fundamental level. They are the equivalent of the sealing formulae that human occult practice has always theorized about. The circles drawn to bind what cannot be bound by physical force alone. In the context of the dark cells, they're the final failsafe. The layer that operates even if a physical cell is breached, even if a rune lock is somehow defeated, even if the wards are disrupted. Light cannot escape from the cells. Sound cannot escape from them. The law is explicit about this, and it's worth dwelling on because it suggests the containment systems are doing something more active than simply building thick walls. Whatever is inside a dark cell is operating in an environment so thoroughly sealed that even the ambient emissions of ordinary physics, photons, vibrations in the air, cannot find their way out. The place is genuinely, completely dark and silent in the most literal sense of those words. But here is the detail that I find most quietly unsettling about the dark cells, the one that tells you more about the nature of this place than almost anything else. The air is wrong. The custodians who patrol those corridors, individuals who have faced the worst the galaxy has to offer, who are psychologically fortified against things that would break an ordinary mind in seconds, describe the atmosphere of the dark cells as inherently unsettling, not in a way they can point to specifically, not a smell or a sound, since sound doesn't travel there. It's something that the psychic fortification of the custodian mind registers as a deep, ancient wrongness. It's the aggregate sense of being in proximity to things that should not exist, things that have no place in the comfortable categories of reality that intelligent beings use to organize their experience of the universe. Over 100 custodians patrol those corridors at all times. 100. Not stationed at fixed points, but actively moving, actively watching. Given that the custodes are among the rarest and most precious warriors in the Imperium, fewer than 10,000 of them exist at any given time, and each one represents an investment of resources and decades of development that is beyond calculating. Having more than 100 of them dedicated exclusively to guarding what amounts to a giant locked basement is an extraordinary statement about how important the Emperor and the Imperium consider the contents of those cells to be. There is a door called the Door of Cogs. This is a detail that appears in the lore almost as an aside, but it's worth thinking about carefully. The Door of Cogs is a maintenance entrance to the dark cells that connects to the Mechanicum Ambassador Enclave within the broader Imperial Palace complex. It is used by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who are responsible for maintaining the arcane technology that keeps the cells functional. The containment systems, the power generators, the mechanical components of the rune locks and wards. The existence of this door tells you that the dark cells require ongoing technical maintenance, that they're not simply a one-time construction that sealed itself permanently on the day it was built. They need to be watched over in a technical sense, as well as a physical one. What the lore does not emphasize, but which is implied by context, is the nature of the arrangement with these tech priests. The knowledge required to maintain the dark cells is itself classified beyond almost any level of clearance in the Imperium. The individuals who perform this maintenance are doing so with access to information and understanding that cannot be allowed to propagate. In some sources and contextual inference, it is suggested that the most sensitive maintenance work is performed by individuals who do not leave the complex afterward. The knowledge they carry out with them would be too dangerous. This is a pattern that appears elsewhere in the darkest corners of the Imperium's maintenance culture. Certain things are maintained by people who are, in various ways, prevented from sharing what they've learned. It's an uncomfortable detail, but it speaks to how seriously the secrecy around the dark cells is taken. Not all of the prisoners are truly alive. That is a direct statement from the law, and it is deeply strange when you sit with it. Not all of the prisoners are truly alive, but all of them have anima. Anima is a Latin word meaning spirit or soul, and its use here is deliberate. Whatever is in those cells, even the things that are not alive in any conventional biological sense, has a quality of presence, of selfhood, of interior life that can be perceived by those sensitive enough to detect it. They exist. They are aware. They are, in some cases, not alive, but also not dead in any simple or final way. They are in a third category that human language struggles to accommodate, because the categories of alive and dead are sufficient for the universe that most humans experience, but they break down in the context of some of the things that have been locked away beneath the Imperial Palace. The final detail I want to dwell on before we move on to the guards themselves is this. The law describes the dark air of the cells as capable of putting even the iron-willed custodians on edge, not terrifying them. These are not beings who terrify easily, not overwhelming them. They maintain their post. But there is a quality to the darkness down there that registers even on minds specifically designed and developed to resist exactly this kind of influence. Something seeps out, even through all those layers of containment, not the content of the cells, the information, the knowledge, the specific nature of what's inside, but something more diffuse, a presence, a weight, the accumulated psychic and metaphysical pressure of things that have no business being anywhere, locked in a place built to make sure they can never be anywhere. It settles on the shoulders of the Shadowkeepers like gravity, and they carry it because they have to, because if they don't, the consequences for the rest of the universe are difficult to calculate and probably catastrophic. Part 5. The Shadowkeepers. Wardens of the world's most dangerous secret, a custodian in golden armor is already one of the most imposing figures in the galaxy. Their sheer physical presence, standing head and shoulders above a space marine, encased in personally crafted auramite rather than mass-produced power armor, moving with the practiced efficiency of beings who have spent decades in physical and mental refinement, is designed to communicate authority and power in a way that goes beyond words. They are symbols as much as soldiers. The Shadowkeepers wear black. This is not a small distinction. The choice of color in the Custodes order carries weight that it might not carry in a more casual military organization. The golden armor of the 10,000 is tied to their identity as the Emperor's personal guard, the direct expression of his will in the physical world. It catches light deliberately. It announces itself. For the Shadowkeepers, who serve a purpose that cannot be announced, who guard things whose existence is not publicly acknowledged, the black armor makes the same statement in reverse. They are the part of the Emperor's will that works in the dark. They are the part that is not supposed to be noticed until it's too late to avoid the problem they represent. Their formal designation within the custodian structure is the Shadowkeepers, also known as the Wardens of the Dark Cells. They are a shield host, a specific designated unit within the broader Adeptus Custodes organization. Within their ranks, the most common type of warrior is the Custodian Warden, a designation that comes with specific oaths of protection that serve a practical psychological function. The oaths of protection help the Wardens focus on the task at hand to the exclusion of everything else. This is not a small thing when the task at hand involves standing in the dark near things that are actively, passively, constantly influencing the minds around them. Having a formal psychological anchor, an oath, a commitment, a defined purpose, is a tool for maintaining sanity and effectiveness in circumstances specifically designed to erode both. The leaders of the Shadowkeepers carry weapons that the law describes as being of mysterious provenance. This is an interesting phrase because it implies that even within the custodian organization, the exact origin of these weapons is either unknown or not fully documented. Ancient weapons, things that predate the current era, possibly things that predate the heresy, possibly things that were acquired during the Great Crusade from locations that don't appear in public records. The specific intended use of these weapons is stated explicitly. They are a last resort. They are for use in the event that something breaks free from the cells. In that specific scenario, an entity or artifact escaping containment, these weapons are apparently uniquely appropriate in a way that standard custodian armaments are not. What that means in practice, what properties these weapons must have to serve that function, is left to the imagination. The Shadowkeepers also make use of a relic called the Auric Shackles, which are fetters that were themselves forged during the Dark Age of technology. The function of the Auric Shackles is extraordinary. They adapt themselves to shut down the neural nets of any sentient being, rendering even the thought of escape impossible. Not just the physical capacity for escape, the thought of it. They apparently operate at a level that is simultaneously physical and cognitive, suppressing the agency of whatever they're placed on, not merely through physical constraint, but through direct interference with the mental processes that would generate and sustain the will to escape. This implies that at least some of the things the Shadowkeepers expect to be chasing and recapturing are capable of planning their own escape even while physically confined, which means the shackles need to address that layer of capability in addition to the physical one. The leader of the Shadowkeepers holds the title of Lockwarden. This is the shield captain who bears ultimate responsibility for the dark cells, for the vigil, for the condition of every cell and every prisoner and every artifact in the complex. The Lockwarden must be, in the words of the law, the sternest of all guardians, the most unrelenting and alert jailer on the face of Terra. In practical terms, this means that beyond their duties as a custodian warrior, the Lockwarden functions as a prison administrator, a crisis manager, and a field commander, because it is the Lockwarden's personal responsibility to oversee any recapture mission when something escapes, and any new imprisonment operation when something needs to be added to the cells. The current Lockwarden, as of the late 41st Millennium, is a shield captain named Borsa Thusk. He has held the position for a century and a half, which is a significant tenure even for a custodian, whose extended lifespan means that their standards for a long time are calibrated very differently from those of ordinary humans. Thirsk is described in the sources as a grim and frighteningly intense warrior, which, given that all custodians are already frightening by most normal standards, tells you something about the particular nature of the intensity he projects. His fearlessness and vigilance make him ideal for a role in which fear is an occupational hazard, and vigilance is a matter of galactic consequence. Here is a detail that quietly tells you everything about how the galaxy has changed in recent years. Before the Great Rift opened, Borsa Thirsk had left Terra exactly twice since becoming Lockwarden. Twice, in a century and a half. He was stationed on that one world, in that one complex, managing that one vigil, with essentially no cause to go anywhere else, because the situation in the dark cells, while always demanding and always unsettling, was stable enough that his presence there was the right call 100% of the time. Since the Great Rift opened, he has barely set foot on Terra at all. What that tells you about the scope of what happened when the Great Rift split the galaxy, we'll get to in detail. But the image of a warrior who spent a century and a half anchored to the same spot, now found permanently abroad, hunting things across the breadth of the galaxy, that image carries weight. There is a historical precedent for the Shadowkeepers deploying away from Terra, and it's instructive. During the burning of Prospero, the same event in which the ancient warders of the vaults of Rython were deployed, several sodalities of Shadowkeepers, or their predecessors under that name, participated in the military action against the Thousand Sons. The law notes this with specific emphasis on how unusual it was. The Shadowkeepers did not normally leave. The fact that they did during the Prospero campaign is itself described as mysterious. Some historians of the Horus Heresy period have suggested that their presence there spoke to a need for reserves more desperate than was publicly acknowledged. That perhaps the burning of Prospero, for reasons not made clear in the public record, required something that only these warriors and their specific skill set could provide. The Shadowkeepers' psychological burden is something worth considering carefully, because I think it's easy to look at them and see simply very good soldiers doing a very hard job.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and just be honest with you about something. When I first started going down the rabbit hole on this topic, I expected it to be cool. I expected vaults, monsters, locked doors, the usual 40k flavor of everything being massive and terrible and ancient. And it is all of those things. But what actually got me, what I did not expect, was how sad it is. Like, think about the Shadowkeepers for a moment. These are the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. And their entire existence, their entire purpose, is to stand in a dark corridor next to something the universe made a mistake putting into existence and just make sure it stays put. No glory, no crusade, no victory they can ever claim out loud. Just the dark and the watch and the understanding that if they stop, everything ends. That hits differently than I thought it would. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. Let's go back to the video.
And that's true. They are. And they do. But the specific nature of the psychological strain involved in their vigil is not the same as the strain of active combat or even the strain of extended deployment in hostile environments. The Shadowkeepers are not fighting what they guard. They're not engaging with it in any direct way. They are standing in its presence, day after day, decade after decade, century after century, feeling the wrongness that emanates from the cells without being able to do anything about it, without being able to process it, without the release valve that combat provides. They simply absorb it and continue. Some of them have been doing this for hundreds of years. The oaths they take, the psychological conditioning they undergo, the specific training that prepares a custodian for the Shadowkeepers rather than for other roles. All of this is designed to build a kind of fortress inside the mind, a structure of purpose and identity, rigid enough to withstand the constant, quiet erosion of proximity to things that should not exist. Even so, the lore suggests that the air in those corridors gets to them, that they feel it even through all that conditioning, that the sternest of warriors, after enough time in those lower levels, carries something they didn't carry before. They carry it anyway, because the alternative to carrying it is unthinkable. Part 6. What's inside? The known prisoners and relics. This is the part that everyone wants, and I'm going to be honest with you from the start. The lore is deliberately vague about the specific contents of the dark cells. This is not an accident or a failure of world building. It is a choice made with intention, and by the time we're done today, I want you to understand why the vagueness is actually more disturbing than a detailed inventory would be. But let's talk about what we do know, because even the partial picture is striking. The first thing to establish is the broad category of what the dark cells contains, because this sets the stakes for everything else. The lore describes the contents as entities and artifacts that date back to the Age of Strife, and, by implication, to the even older Dark Age of technology, that could be used to annihilate the Imperium of man itself if they were to break free or fall into the wrong hands. Not could cause significant damage, not could threaten a sector, annihilate the Imperium of man itself, the largest human political entity in the history of the species, a civilization spanning 1,000,000 worlds. This is what could be destroyed by what lives beneath the palace floor. The implication of this is that the dark cells contain things that represent existential threats on a civilizational scale. Not individual monsters, however powerful. There are other places and other warriors for dealing with those. The dark cells hold things that have the capability, if deployed or released, to end humanity's presence in the galaxy as a meaningful force. Let's look at the specific things the lore has confirmed. The slithering dreamer was one of the cell's occupants until the opening of the Great Rift. Its name alone tells you something about the nature of this entity. Not a machine, not a conventional monster, not something that maps cleanly onto existing categories. Something that slithers, something that dreams. The distinction between those two verbs is interesting because slithering implies physical movement, while dreaming implies an interior mental life of some kind. The slithering dreamer was apparently doing both of those things simultaneously in whatever state the dark cells kept it in, and when the Great Rift's opening disrupted the containment systems, it got out. A Shadowkeeper named Jehal Feldorus Kau tracked it across the galaxy, specifically to a world called Tarnus IV, and killed it there. This is notable for several reasons. First, the fact that it could be killed implies it was not the most extreme category of occupant, or perhaps that the right weapons make the difference. Second, the fact that it required one of the Shadowkeepers to travel from Terra to track and kill it tells you it had enough agency to move and hide and apparently try to establish itself somewhere. The slithering dreamer wasn't just released and sitting there waiting to be recaptured. It went somewhere. It had a destination. It had a purpose. What that purpose was, we don't know. Beyond the slithering dreamer, the lore offers us tantalizing but incomplete glimpses. The old sources describe prisoners that include what amount to immortal entities from the Age of Strife, things that were encountered during the Great Crusade, as Imperial forces swept across the galaxy, things that resisted destruction but could be contained, and that were then brought to Terra for exactly that purpose. Old Night, the worst period of the Age of Strife, apparently produced creatures and phenomena that the Dark Age of Technology's collapsing safety systems had allowed to emerge. Some of these were entities that existed partially in the warp and partially in physical space, making them effectively immune to physical destruction. You could damage or disperse their physical component, but their warp-adjacent essence would simply reconstitute, often worse than before. Containment was the only viable option. There are also described what appear to be autonomous constructs from the Dark Age of Technology, things built by the civilization that existed before the Age of Strife, before even the Unification Wars, by the kind of scientific capability that could construct the Golden Throne and the Webway technology and the standard template constructs. Masterless constructs, the lore calls them, which is an evocative description. Machines that were built to serve a master who no longer exists, that have been running on whatever mission they were given long after the civilization that gave them that mission fell. A masterless construct of sufficient sophistication is not simply a machine, it's a goal without context, a capability without guidance, a weapon without a target, and therefore effectively a weapon aimed at everything. These things apparently exist in the cells too, sealed away because what they were built to do could not be safely redirected and could not be simply turned off. There is a reference in the lore to prisoners who are not alive, but who have anima, who have presence, who are somehow aware of their situation, even in a condition that cannot be straightforwardly described as living. This suggests that among the occupants of the dark cells are some that exist in genuinely novel states of being. Not undead in the standard Warhammer sense, not demons exactly, not ghosts, not constructs, but something that doesn't map onto any of those categories precisely. Things that are aware but not alive, things that remember being alive but no longer are, things that have been here so long that whatever they were when they first entered has been altered by the mere experience of being held in these circumstances. The lore also implies that not all of the items in the cells are entities. Some are artifacts, physical objects, whose containment is required because the knowledge they embody or the capability they represent is too dangerous to allow into the wider world. What these artifacts are specifically is not made clear, but their description as things that could annihilate the Imperium gives some sense of their potential. Perhaps weapons from the Dark Age of Technology, functional mechanivores in miniature, or devices capable of targeting and disrupting the warp in ways that would have catastrophic collateral effects. Perhaps things that are less weapons and more keys, objects that, if operated correctly, would open doors that nobody sane once opened, into places or states or relationships with the universe that humanity is much better off not having access to. The fact that the Shadowkeepers carry weapons of mysterious origin, specifically intended as a last resort for dealing with cell occupants that get loose, tells you something important about the variety of what's inside. A single type of weapon could not serve as a last resort against every possible occupant. The occupants must be varied enough in nature that the weapon needs to be something versatile, something that operates at a fundamental enough level to be effective against a wide range of threats. Whatever these weapons are, and the sources genuinely don't tell us, they are things that can deal effectively with entities that apparently cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. There are also cells that, by the time of the Great Rift, were found empty, with no trace of their former occupants. Not just escaped, vanished. The Shadowkeepers who had been on patrol when this happened were found dead. The cells were opened from the instant somehow, by something that understood the locking mechanisms well enough to defeat them, or by some external force that bypassed the mechanisms entirely. The implications of this are significant. Whatever was in those specific cells either understood its own containment well enough to escape it given the right opportunity, or had allies or connections in the wider world that could reach in and open the locks when the conditions aligned. The opening of the Great Rift provided that opportunity, providing the disruption in reality that the containment systems apparently relied upon stability to maintain. One more detail before we move on. There is a reference in the broader lore to the Dark Cells, potentially containing things that are connected to or remnants of the cybernetic revolt itself. Not necessarily functional men of iron in full operational condition, but things related to the machines of that ancient war. Components, systems, artifacts, possibly even partial intelligences that survived in some truncated or contained form. If this is true, then among the things the Shadowkeepers are watching over are the remnants of the war that nearly ended humanity 60,000 years ago. Things that were already old when the Unification Wars began. Things that have been locked away for so long that the civilization that created them would be completely unrecognizable to anyone alive today. This is the Dark Cells, not a prison for the bad guys who've been caught, a prison for things that cannot be allowed to exist freely in the universe and cannot be destroyed. A permanent, vigilant, incredibly expensive vigil over the worst that humanity has ever made or encountered, maintained at all times by warriors who are themselves among the most extraordinary human beings who have ever lived, and for whom this assignment is considered so important that it takes precedence over almost every other use to which their extraordinary capabilities could be put. Part 7, the Library Sanctus, Knowledge Too Dangerous to Know. Not everything dangerous can be locked in a cell. Some of the most threatening things in the universe are not entities or objects, but information. Knowledge that, if widely disseminated, would destabilize the foundations on which the Imperium of man has been built. Histories that would change how people understand their own civilization. Scientific truths that would make certain technologies available to those who should never have them. Records of events that the official historical narrative requires to have been interpreted in a specific way. This kind of dangerous knowledge is stored in the Library Sanctus. The Library Sanctus is an imperial archive located on Terra, and that bare description makes it sound far more benign than it is. It is not a place where curious scholars go to read rare books, or where historians with the right clearance can access primary documents. The Library Sanctus holds what the lore describes as information on some of the most ancient and sinister events and artifacts in galactic history, and access to it is so tightly controlled that its existence is itself, in a practical sense, one of the things being kept secret. It is a library in the way that the Dark Cells is a prison. The form is familiar, but the function operates at a level of consequence that makes ordinary comparisons feel inadequate. The most vivid account we have of the Library Sanctus comes from a document known as the Journal of Keeper Cripias, which is written from the perspective of a man named Cripias, who identifies himself as the last keeper of the Library Sanctus in his own time. working in the 41st millennium. His account gives a name not just to himself, but to an entire institutional tradition, the Keepers of the Library Sanctus, a lineage of scholars and guardians who have maintained this archive for 836 generations. Let me make that number concrete. Crippius describes labouring for 70 years as his immediate predecessor had, and his predecessor before him through 836 generations of successive keepers. 836 generations is roughly 20,000 years or more, depending on average generational length, which puts the origins of the Library Sanctus and its institutional memory back before even the Dark Age of technology in some framings, or at least deep into the earliest periods of organised human civilization. Crippius describes the Library Sanctus as holding records that no one outside its stone chamber has ever learned. He lists some of them. These are the things that even the Keeper himself treats with a kind of reverence mixed with dread when he enumerates them in his journal. The betrayal of Luther. This is significant. Luther was the companion of Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, who fell to chaos and led the corruption of a substantial portion of the Dark Angels Legion during the Horus Heresy, a fact that the Dark Angels have been desperately trying to keep secret for the past 10,000 years, and for which they continue to hunt the fallen members of their order. The Library Sanctus apparently holds the true account of Luther's betrayal, which means it holds records that could answer questions about the Dark Angels' history that the Dark Angels themselves would prefer remained unanswered. The Curse of the Red Thirst. This is the Blood Angels' darkest secret, the genetic flaw in their line that manifests as a bloodlust so extreme that it can reduce one of the Emperor's finest warriors to a state of near mindless murderous consumption. The Red Thirst is acknowledged within the Blood Angels and their successor chapters, but the full truth of what it is, where it came from, and what its long-term implications are. These are matters of extreme sensitivity. The Library Sanctus has the record, the dark-shrouded founding of the Sisterhood, the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. The exact circumstances of the Sisterhood's creation are tied up in the Age of Apostasy, one of the most politically fraught periods in imperial history. When the ecclesiarchy accrued political power it was constitutionally prohibited from having, and the settlement that was eventually reached involved the creation of an all-female military order that technically didn't violate the letter of the law because the law specified that the ecclesiarchy could not maintain men-at-arms. The full, unvarnished account of how the Sisterhood was actually founded, the political manoeuvring, the compromises, the things that had to be sacrificed to make it work, apparently resides in the Library Sanctus, the unseen mysteries concerning the origins of the Space Marine legions. This is perhaps the most tantalizing entry in Crippius's list, because the origins of the Space Marine legions, their initial creation in the early days of the Great Crusade, the processes by which they were developed, the experiments and failures that preceded the successes, are a topic about which the official record has many, many gaps. The Library Sanctus apparently has some of what fills those gaps, and the characterization of it as unseen mysteries, rather than simply records, suggests these aren't just administrative documents, the names of the sinister architects of the Imgur monolith. The Imgur monolith is a Necron construct of extraordinary power, located in the Ultima Segmentum, capable of duplicating Necron warships on contact. For most of its known history, the identity of its builders was considered unknown, which, for a Necron construct, means unknown among the humans who were observing it. The Library Sanctus, according to the account of Keeper Crippius, holds the answer to this question, which means that someone with access to the Library Sanctus knew, at the time that record was made, which Necron dynasty or entity or will was responsible for building a device capable of multiplying an already terrifying military force. There is also reference to information about the Men of Iron, the history of the cybernetic revolt, apparently in more detail and with more accuracy than is available anywhere else in the Imperium. This makes sense if you consider the age of the Library Sanctus's institutional memory. If keepers have been maintaining this archive for close to 20,000 years, then some of them were maintaining it during or shortly after the events of the cybernetic revolt itself. They would have had access to records that have since been destroyed or lost everywhere else. The access protocols for the Library Sanctus are, predictably, extraordinarily restrictive. The Keepers themselves are the primary guardians of this knowledge, and they operate under a tradition that Crippius describes as one of oral rather than written transmission, knowledge passing from keeper to keeper through direct instruction, rather than being written down where it could be read by someone unauthorized. The written records that do exist in the Library Sanctus are kept in conditions that prevent their deterioration, presumably through stasis technology of some kind, and are not accessible to visitors regardless of their rank or affiliation. The Library Sanctus and the Dark Cells are related in a very specific way. They are two sides of the same principle of imperial secrecy. The Dark Cells contains things that cannot be allowed to physically exist freely. The Library Sanctus contains information that cannot be allowed to circulate freely. Together, they represent the fullest expression of the Imperium's philosophy about the relationship between danger and knowledge. Some things are so dangerous that the only appropriate response is to seal them away and stand watch over them forever. There is an implicit question here that I don't think the law quite asks directly, but that hovers over everything. Why keep the knowledge at all? Why not destroy the records? If the information in the Library Sanctus is too dangerous to share, why maintain it for 836 generations rather than simply burning everything down? The answer, I think, is that the knowledge is too important to lose. The history of humanity's worst mistakes is not useful to most people, but it is absolutely essential to the people whose job it is to make sure those mistakes are never repeated. The Library Sanctus doesn't exist for scholars. It exists for the people making decisions about what to do when something terrible happens, so that they can look up what happened the last time something terrible happened. It is institutional memory of the most extreme kind, maintained at enormous cost, precisely because losing it would be even more costly. Part 8. Kanga Maru. The vault under the mountain. Not everything in the Himalayan range is dark or sealed in the way the Dark Cells are. The mountains have layers. They have always had layers. Beneath them run the chambers, where the Emperor once created the Primarchs, still sealed and classified beyond the access of any living soul, with the possible exception of the Emperor himself. And he is, in the current era, occupied elsewhere. Beneath them runs the great complex of the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that makes warp navigation across the Imperium possible. And beneath one specific peak, beneath the mountain called Rakaposhi, there is a place called Kanga Maru. In the language it comes from, a language so old that it was already dead by the time of the Unification Wars. Kanga Maru is simply a name. The people who ended up inside it had a different name for it. They called it the Vault. Kanga Maru is the largest and most secure imperial prison on Terra, and its history predates the Imperium itself by a very long margin. The law is specific on this point. It had been constructed at least 1,000 standard years before the Horus heresy began, by persons unknown. 1,000 years before the heresy puts the construction of this prison facility back before the Great Crusade, back before the Unification Wars, back into a period when Terra was still a fractured wasteland of techno-barbarian states, and the Emperor was still in the process of consolidating his control over the planet. Someone, during that period of chaos and warfare, built a maximum security prison complex under a Himalayan mountain, and then apparently either died or disappeared or chose not to take credit for it, because no one knows who built it. The Emperor found it, or perhaps he knew of it, or perhaps he built it himself under circumstances that were, for reasons of security, not attributed to him. The law is silent on this, which is itself a kind of answer. Whatever the case, by the time of the Unification Wars, Kanga Maru was in the possession of entities aligned with the emerging imperial authority, and it was being used to house exactly the kind of prisoner for whom it had apparently been designed. The physical construction of the prison is remarkable. The cells and walls were cut directly from the limestone of the mountain, which gave them a quality of geological permanence. These were not walls erected, but walls revealed, the rock itself sculpted into containment. This natural rock was layered with adamantium plating throughout, giving the structure a physical durability that went well beyond ordinary prison architecture. For cells intended to hold psychers, and some of the most dangerous people who would end up in Kanga Maru were psychers of extraordinary capability. Psi-resistant crystals were built into the walls themselves, creating an environment that suppressed or disrupted the kind of psychic activity that a determined and powerful mind could otherwise use to influence its surroundings or communicate with the outside world. The security systems went further than passive containment. There were multiple active security measures, including cell blocks that could be dropped into abyssal holes in the ground during an escape attempt, an elegant and final solution to certain scenarios. Combat servitors armed with autocannons and assault cannons were positioned throughout, capable of responding to breach situations with overwhelming firepower. The physical security of the place was designed by someone who understood the human capacity for ingenuity in desperate circumstances, and had attempted to account for every possible vector of escape. The prison was overseen by the Legio Custodes during the early period, which tells you immediately that the category of prisoner it was meant to hold was considered important enough to warrant the most elite guardians available. This was not a facility for ordinary criminals, however dangerous. Ordinary criminals, by the standards of an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds, and has dealt with everything from alien invasions to demonic incursions, are handled by more ordinary means. Who was in Kanga Maru? The most notable names from the Unification Wars period are the defeated tyrants of the techno-barbarian states. William the Red, the Prince of Albion, the lord of the territory that had once been the British Isles, who had ruled his domain with the particular cruelty and cunning of a warlord who understood that the world was brutal and had decided to be more brutal than everything else in it. He went into Kanga Maru in a cell that the law notes was specifically designed for him by the Emperor himself, which implies that William possessed characteristics, powers, capabilities, contacts, resilience that required a custom containment solution rather than a standard cell. The ethnarch of the Caucasus Wastes, the ruler of a powerful techno-barbarian state, located in the Caucasus Peninsula, a domain that had managed to hold out against the Emperor's advance for an impressive period through a combination of technological sophistication and geographic defensibility. The ethnarch ended up in Kanga Maru after the Salamander's Legion played a significant role in bringing his domain to heel. A cell waited for him under the mountain. Nathan Doom, described in the sources as the tyrant of the Pan-Pacific Empire, and as half-mad, half-genius, arguably the most formidable of all the warlords who opposed the Emperor during the Unification Wars. Dumay controlled one of the largest and most powerful of the techno-barbarian states, a domain spanning the Pacific Islands and parts of East Asia and Australia. He was the warlord who had the clearest chance, out of any of the Emperor's opponents, of genuinely being able to fight the Imperium to a standstill if the war had gone differently. In the end, Captain General Konstantin Valdor urged that Doom be executed rather than imprisoned. And for once, the prison cell under Rakaposhi was not the destination. His lieutenants ended up in Kanga Maru, however. During the Great Crusade that followed the Unification Wars, Kanga Maru became a repository for more of the Empire's most dangerous prisoners, individuals who opposed the Emperor's vision for humanity in ways too extreme to be accommodated by any political settlement. The law mentions conspirators, renegades, individuals who possessed knowledge or capabilities that made their existence outside of maximum security containment unacceptably risky. Then the Horus Heresy began, and Kanga Maru became part of something nobody had anticipated, the imprisonment of Space Marines. When news of the heresy reached Terra, and it became clear that the traitorous Primarchs had drawn their legions to Horus's banner, Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who was overseeing the defense of Terra, faced a particular problem. Within the Imperial City on the outskirts of the Imperial Palace, there was a group called the Crusader Host. Space Marines drawn from all 18 legions, including many of the legions that had now gone to Chaos, who had been stationed on Terra as an honor guard. These were warriors from traitor legions who happened to be on Terra when the heresy broke out, who hadn't yet had the chance to make their choices clearly, who might be loyal or might be waiting for an opportunity that hadn't arrived yet. Dawn made a decision that was simultaneously pragmatic and ruthless. He had the entire Crusader host imprisoned in Kanga Maru, all of them except the Imperial Fists members, who he presumably trusted. The fate of the Crusader host in the prison is a story unto itself, involving a desperate escape attempt by 7 members who became known as the Outcast Dead. A story that ends badly for most of them on the streets of the Imperial Palace. But the point is that at the height of the Horus heresy, Kanga Maru was pressed into service as a prison for Space Marines, which tells you something about both the desperation of the situation and the security capability of the facility. You don't lock up Astartes in a building you're not confident can hold them. One cell was made ready that was never occupied, a cell specifically prepared for Horus Lupercal himself, the War Master, the Primarch who had started everything. Dawn and the Imperial forces apparently held on to the possibility, however slim, that Horus might be captured alive rather than killed, or perhaps simply wanted to have the option available. A cell was built in the most impregnable cell block of Kanga Maru, with the specific characteristics necessary to hold a Primarch. As far as we know, that cell was never used. Horus died on his flagship in orbit above Terra, and his body was destroyed. The cell waits. By the 41st millennium, Kanga Maru in its original form is not prominently described in active use. The structure still exists. The Himalayan sublevels still house various things that need to be kept well away from the general population. But the institutional focus around it has shifted somewhat. The Dark Cells, with their focus on the truly existential category of threat, have become the primary concern of the custodian organization. But the history of the facility under Rakaposhi is a reminder that Terra has been in the business of storing its worst people and its worst secrets for a very long time, and that the infrastructure for that kind of storage is ancient and deep and extensive. The lore mentions in passing that beneath the Himalayan shelf, the broader geographic region within which Rakaposhi sits, dangerous entities of various kinds are regularly dealt with in small skirmishes by custodians attempting to prevent escapes. The sublevels of the Himalayan range are, apparently, not simply a collection of known and mapped vaults with known contents. There are things down there that have gotten loose from whatever originally held them and are now loose in the sublevels, where they are periodically encountered and dealt with by the warriors assigned to keep the mountain range secure. How long this has been going on, what exactly these things are, and whether any of them are escapees from Kanga Maru proper, the lore does not specify. Some of the most complex secrets in the universe are not the ones that are locked up with careful ceremony. They're the ones that got away quietly, in the dark, when no one was quite paying enough attention, and have been hiding in the walls ever since. Part 9, The Golden Throne, the deepest secret of all. There is a chamber at the heart of the Imperial Palace so heavily guarded that almost no one who has ever entered it has left and told a complete account of what they saw. The Sanctum Imperialis, the room that contains the Golden Throne. And the Golden Throne is itself a vault in its way, a container for a secret so enormous that calling it a vault feels almost small. But the Golden Throne has a secret beneath its secret that I want to talk about today, because it connects directly to everything we've been discussing about the sealed places under Terra. The throne is not just a life support machine for a dying god, it is a door. And underneath that door is one of the most significant sealed locations in the entire Imperium. Let's go back to the beginning of the throne, because context matters enormously here. During the Dark Age of technology, that golden, catastrophic age of human science, someone built a machine, a specific machine located in a desert on the Terran continent of Asia, buried deep beneath the surface. This machine was a portal, a device that provided access to the webway, the network of dimension-tunneling transit corridors constructed by the Old Ones, and later used primarily by the Ice Eldari civilization. The webway is, in simple terms, a faster-than-light transit system that bypasses the warp entirely. You don't enter the warp, you enter an entirely separate dimension that was built for the purpose of safe travel, and you emerge wherever you need to be without the dangers that come with warp navigation, without the need for navigators or astropaths, without the risk of demonic incursion, without the temporal distortions that make warp travel so unpredictable. Whoever built this device on Terra understood the webway well enough to create a fixed entry point into it, which represents a level of technological sophistication that is genuinely difficult to overstate. The Emperor found this device. He found it during his early operations on Terra, possibly during the Unification Wars, possibly before, and he understood immediately what it was and what it could mean for humanity. He kept it secret. He built the structure that would become the Imperial Palace partly around it. And then, 2 centuries into the Great Crusade, he returned to Terra and set in motion what he called the Imperial Webway Project, also known internally as the Great Work. The project was breathtaking in its ambition. The Emperor intended to use the Terran Webway portal as the entry point for an enormous construction effort within the webway itself, building a new section of tunnels extending from the portal on Terra outward, connecting to the existing elder-built sections of the webway network, and ultimately providing humanity with an alternative to warp travel that was safe, fast, and practically unlimited in scope. If it had succeeded, the Imperium would not need navigators or astropaths. It would not need to expose itself to the warp with every journey. It would not need to fear the demonic incursions that warp travel makes possible. Humanity would be able to move across the galaxy with the efficiency and safety that the Eldari once enjoyed. The problem was that the human-built sections of the webway, unlike the Elder-built sections, were not made from the psychically resistant material that naturally insulated the webway from warp penetration. To keep the new human sections safe from demonic intrusion, the Emperor had to personally maintain a psychic shield over the entire expanding network, sitting on the throne, channeling his power, holding the barrier in place continuously. This was why he had left the Great Crusade in the hands of the Primarchs. He was not bored or retiring or disengaged. He was doing the most important job in human history, quietly, in a dungeon beneath the Imperial Palace, and he could not tell anyone what he was doing because the security implications of the knowledge were too extreme. An army of tech priests and laborers worked within the webway, building the new tunnels under the Emperor's psychic protection. Custodians patrolled the developing network. For a time, the project was proceeding. Then Magnus the Red happened. When Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, used his immense psychic power to send a warning to his father about Horus's betrayal, an act that technically violated the Edict of Nicaea, which had banned exactly this kind of sorcerous long-distance communication. The massive, sudden, uncontrolled psychic working ripped apart the delicate wards that the Emperor had constructed to shield the human sections of the webway. The shields didn't weaken, they didn't crack. They were destroyed in an instant by an act of force so extreme that the Emperor himself could not compensate for it quickly enough. The warp flooded into the human webway sections. Everything the Emperor had built was suddenly exposed to the full howling nightmarish landscape of the Imperium, and the things that live in the Imperium flooded through the breach. The custodians and Sisters of Silence, who had been working and patrolling inside the webway, were suddenly fighting a desperate battle against a demonic invasion within the tunnels themselves. A battle that was, by definition, invisible to the rest of the galaxy, fought in a dimension that most people didn't even know had been breached, by warriors who could not call for reinforcements because the existence of the project was still secret. They fought hard. The custodians who went into the webway during those years were reduced from thousands to hundreds. They held as long as they could. Eventually, they were forced to retreat, pulling back through the Terran portal and sealing it behind them. The Imperial Webway project was over. The dream was finished. And now the portal that had been the entry point, the portal under the Golden Throne, had to be kept permanently sealed because the other side of it was full of demons. The Emperor's choice, going forward, was to remain on the throne and keep the portal sealed with his psychic power. not because the throne needed him to operate as a life support system. That modification came later, after the heresy, after he was mortally wounded by Horus. Before the siege of Terra, the Emperor was on the throne specifically to hold the webway portal closed. If he left, the portal would open, and the warp, already flooded into the human-built webway sections, would pour through directly into the dungeon beneath the Imperial Palace, and from there potentially into the palace above, and from there into Terra, and from there potentially across the Sol system and beyond. This is the deepest of all the secrets under Terra. Not just a vault with dangerous contents, a door that must never, ever be opened, because behind it is not merely a dangerous thing, but an entire dimension's worth of demonic force, constantly pressing against the seal, constantly looking for an opportunity to break through. After the siege of Terra, after Horus was dead and the Emperor was mortally wounded, Rogel Dawn and the surviving Primarchs faced a decision. What to do with the Emperor's body, and what to do about the portal. The answer they chose, following the Emperor's own instructions, was to modify the Golden Throne from its original function as a webway access device into a life support system powerful enough to sustain whatever remained of the Emperor's consciousness. The Emperor would remain on the throne, not to keep the webway portal closed, but because the throne was the only thing keeping him alive. But here is the thing. Both functions remain active. The Emperor sustains himself on the throne, and the Emperor keeps the portal closed. These are not two separate things happening in two separate systems. They are both happening simultaneously, in the same device, powered by the same immense psychic presence. If the Emperor dies, if the throne fails, if the psychers who sacrifice themselves to fuel it run out, if the deteriorating mechanisms of the device finally give way, both things stop simultaneously. The Emperor's consciousness ends, and the portal beneath the throne opens. The Forbidden Vault is the name that some sources use for the chamber directly beneath the Golden Throne. The chamber that contains the sealed webway portal itself. It has adamantium gates locked with stasis fields, and entry requires authorization at the highest possible level. Within it are described things that go beyond even the Dark Cell's insensitivity, collected knowledge from the dawn of human civilization that could drive individuals insane. Records of things that have happened, things that have been done, things that exist beyond the comfortable categories that ordinary minds use to process reality. The Golden Throne is a vault in the truest sense. It contains a secret. The secret is a door. And behind the door is everything the Emperor spent decades trying to prevent. In the 41st millennium, the throne is failing. The Mechanicus cannot repair it. The technology it is built from is beyond their understanding, beyond even the most advanced knowledge available to the Adeptus Mechanicus. They can perform maintenance. They can slow the deterioration. They can throw more and more human psychers into the mechanism to keep it functioning, but they cannot fix it. 4 times as many psychers are required now as were required in earlier centuries to maintain the same level of function. The degradation is ongoing and accelerating. The endpoint of that trajectory, if nothing changes, is a moment when the throne stops working. What happens then is not something the Imperium has a plan for, not really. They have contingency plans, prayers, theories, but no plan. The portal stays closed because the Emperor is alive, barely, fractionally, clinging to a thread of existence through 10,000 years of continuous agony. And that is the deepest vault under Terra, not a room, a god. Barely alive, holding a door shut. Part 10. When the locks broke, the Great Rift and the empty cells. For 10,000 years, the system held. Not perfectly. There were incidents. There are always incidents when you're maintaining containment of things that want, in some fundamental sense, to not be contained. But the big picture remained stable. The dark cells were secure. The Shadowkeepers were watching. The vigil continued. Whatever was inside those 81 levels of rune-locked oubliettes stayed inside. The galaxy outside continued to be, in the specific sense of not being destroyed by what was under the palace, safe. Then came the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon's most successful assault on the Imperium in 10,000 years. Cadia fell, and in the aftermath of Cadia's destruction, something happened that reshaped the galaxy at a fundamental level. The Great Rift tore open. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Wound of Ill Fortune, is a massive galaxy-spanning warp storm that split the Imperium roughly in half along a jagged diagonal line running from the Eye of Terra in the Segmentum Obscurus to the distant reaches of the Segmentum Ultima. This wasn't a localized warp disturbance. This was a permanent change to the structure of the galaxy, a wound in reality that has not closed and shows no sign of closing. The warp is now continuously, actively bleeding into real space along the length of the rift, creating conditions throughout the galaxy that are substantially more dangerous than they were before. For the Dark Cells, the consequences were immediate and severe. The Great Rift's opening coincided with the Battle of Lionsgate, the demonic assault on Terra itself that marked the beginning of the terrible period known as the Noctis Eterna, the long night in which the Astronomicon flickered and died, and the galaxy spent a period of indeterminate length, isolated and struggling. The Battle of Lionsgate brought demonic forces directly to Terra. For the first time since the Siege of Terra 10,000 years ago, actual demon-born violence was playing out against the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. Lockwarden Borsa Thirsk faced a decision during this battle. The Shadowkeepers, as a military force, were desperately needed for the fighting above. The palace was under assault. Lives were being lost. The entire defensive effort was stretched, and Thirsk made the call. He sent most of his Shadowkeepers into the fight, leaving only a handful behind to guard the cells. Given what happened next, it is very difficult to assess this decision. On one hand, the battle needed warriors, and the Shadowkeepers are extraordinary ones. On the other hand, the thing that happened when the Great Rift opened, and the palace was in chaos, and the warp was bleeding through into real space from every direction. The cells came open, not all of them, not through any conventional mechanism, not through an attack from outside the cells, not through any prisoner overpowering the handful of guards who remained. The cells, specific cells, presumably those whose occupants were connected in some way to the warp in ways the containment systems could not fully account for, opened. The Shadowkeepers who had been left behind to maintain the vigil were found dead. Not killed by a physical fight they had lost, but dead in ways that suggested whatever had gotten out was not something that needed to engage in physical combat to cause death. The cells were empty. No trace of their former occupants remained. Thirsk came back from the battle and found this. The lore describes him ordering a retreat from the fighting, abandoning the ongoing engagement, when word reached him of what had happened below. What he found when he returned is not described in clinical detail, but we have the shape of it. Empty cells, dead custodians, and the horrifying gap in the ledger where certain things used to be accounted for and no longer were. The response was unprecedented in 10,000 years of the Shadowkeepers' existence. The Shield host, which had spent 10 millennia essentially stationary, rooted to Terra, to the palace, to the cells, was deployed across the galaxy. Not since the burning of Prospero had elements of this particular Shield host gone to war in the wider galaxy. Now they went everywhere. Their mission, find whatever had escaped and either recapture it or kill it. Jehal Feldorus Cow, whose name we've encountered already, is one of the warriors on these reclamation missions. He had spent 17 years guarding the Dark Cells. He had left Terra only 3 times before, the same pattern of deep, essential rootedness that defines the Shadowkeepers. After the Great Rift, he was hunting across the stars, tracking the entity known as the Slithering Dreamer to Tarnus IV, where he killed it. The name he earned from that hunt was inscribed into his black armor. This is how custodians mark their great deeds. Not medals or commendations, but the name they carry, added to and added to over centuries of service. The Shadowkeepers who are now abroad are not on ordinary military deployments. They are on hunts, reclamation missions, Operations so sensitive that even their comrades in the broader Adeptus Custodes don't know the full details of what they're hunting or why. They operate in small groups, fast-moving, quietly, dealing with whatever they find by whatever means are necessary, and not explaining those means to anyone outside the Order. They are the jailers of the universe, doing their job in a universe that just had a very bad night. One of the most striking things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the Great Rift, in terms of the Shadowkeepers, was a decision that seems initially puzzling. The Shadowkeepers opened one of the dark cells and gave its technology to the Imperial Fists. Not the contents, not whatever was being held in the cell, the technology of the cell itself, the containment systems, the materials, the engineering knowledge of how a dark cell is built and maintained. The Imperial Fist's chapter ship, the Phalanx, had been critically damaged during the chaos of the Noctis Eterna, and the specific technology from the Dark Cell was apparently exactly what was needed to repair it. The Shadowkeepers, who under normal circumstances would not open one of those cells for any reason short of absolute necessity, made the calculation that the survival of the Phalanx, one of the most ancient and powerful chapter ships in existence, a fortress monastery that floats in space and has been integral to the Imperial Fist's identity and capability for 10,000 years, was worth the opening of one cell and the sharing of one very carefully selected subset of the knowledge inside. This tells you that not everything in the dark cells is terrible. Some of it is simply incredibly powerful technology that would be misused if allowed into the wrong hands, or used wrongly if accessed without the context to understand its proper application. The Dark Age of technology produced things that were wonderful and things that were monstrous, and the line between those categories is sometimes surprisingly thin. The Shadowkeepers were also dispatched on a mission to the ruins of Cadia, directly ordered by Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. The mission's details are suppressed even among the Shadowkeepers' comrades. Something about Cadia, in the aftermath of its destruction and the opening of the rift that resulted from it, required the Shadowkeepers' specific expertise. What that was, exactly, is not something the lore has been willing to specify. But the combination of the rift's opening, the damaged cells, the escaped occupants, and a specific mission to a world destroyed in the same general catastrophe suggests a story that is still being written. The galaxy is now a more dangerous place in a very particular way. Some of what was in the dark cells is out there, moving, perhaps hiding, perhaps doing whatever it was always trying to do before the Shadowkeepers caught it and locked it away. The things that escaped in the opening of the Great Rift are now the Shadowkeepers' primary mission, and in a galaxy that is already more chaotic and dangerous than it has been in 10 millennia, adding escaped Apex category threats to the equation is the kind of complication that keeps Lockwarden Thirsk perpetually off Terra. The cells that are still occupied continue to require maintenance and vigilance. New threats have been identified and need to be added, because the Great Rift didn't just release old threats, it created new ones. New abominations have emerged in the wake of the Rift's opening, things born from the increased bleed of warp energy into real space, things that cannot simply be destroyed, things that need to be caught and locked away. The dark cells are not a static archive. They're a living, growing, desperately maintained system that is simultaneously trying to manage what it lost, care for what it has, and make room for what it still needs to capture. Part 11, what the secrecy means. Theory, implication, and the architecture of Imperial horror. We've spent a very long time today walking through the individual rooms and secrets under Terra. I want to step back now and think about what all of this, taken together, actually means. Because the dark vaults of Terra are not just an interesting collection of lore details. They represent something philosophically significant about the nature of the Imperium and, in a broader sense, about the nature of human civilization. The thing that strikes me most about all of these places, the dark cells, the Library Sanctus, Kanga Maru, the sealed webway portal beneath the Golden Throne, is the fundamental principle they all share. These are places that maintain what humanity could not destroy. This is the key insight, and I think it's underappreciated. The Imperium is an extraordinarily powerful entity by the standards of anything the human mind can readily imagine. 1,000,000 worlds, countless trillions of people, vast armies and navies, the most elite warriors in human history. Space Marine chapters, Titan legions, inquisitorial kill teams, the accumulated military power of 10,000 years of constant warfare. And yet, there are things that all of that cannot destroy. The men of iron who were locked away rather than finished. The entities of old night that custodians cannot kill. The webway portal that cannot be closed without the Emperor's continuous psychic effort. The knowledge in the Library Sanctus that cannot be unlearned once known, and so must be kept away from people who might learn it and then do something terrible with it. The slithering dreamer, which required a custodian warden to track it across the galaxy and somehow end it on Tarnus IV. And the fact that this is reported as an achievement rather than a routine task tells you that killing things that came from the dark cells is not a routine task. The Imperium's response to the things it cannot destroy is to build better cages. This is a deeply human response, actually. When you encounter a problem you cannot solve, you contain it. You build a structure around it. You find a way to manage the problem indefinitely rather than ending it, and then you maintain that management forever and hope that forever is actually long enough. This is what the dark cells are. This is what the Imperial Webway portal is. This is what the Forbidden Vault is. They are all very, very good cages for very, very dangerous things, maintained by very, very dedicated jailers who have made these cages the meaning of their existence. The question of whether this is sustainable is one that the 41st Millennium seems to be answering in real time. The Great Rift's opening demonstrated that the cages are not absolute. The things inside them are not pacified, they are merely held. The moment the holding system weakened, even slightly, some of them got out. And the thing about things that have been held for 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or 20,000 years, is that they have had a very long time to think about the problem of how to get out. And the holding systems, however advanced, have not been significantly upgraded in much of that time. The Imperium's containment strategy has a fundamental vulnerability. It depends on stability. Runic locks depend on physical integrity. Psychic wards depend on the broader psychic environment not becoming too chaotic. Sanctic circles depend on the metaphysical framework of reality, maintaining itself in ways that allow those circles to function. The Great Rift changed all three of those conditions simultaneously. The psychic environment of the galaxy became more chaotic than it had been at any point since the Age of Strife. The metaphysical stability that the containment systems relied on was disrupted, and some of the locks, consequently, failed. This is not a comforting precedent. There is a theory in the fan community. I want to be clear that this is fan speculation, not canonical lore, that the Emperor, in his long and incredibly strategic thinking about the future of humanity, may have intended the dark cells and the other sealed vaults as more than just containment. The argument goes that the Emperor, who could see possible futures to a degree that exceeds any other being in the setting, may have known that some of what was locked away would eventually be needed. That the most dangerous things under Terra are not simply dangers to be managed, but tools to be used at the right moment, in the right circumstances, by the right hands. That the sealed vaults of Terra are not just prisons, but an arsenal, stockpiled against a need so extreme that even the things humanity had every reason to destroy had to be preserved instead. This is speculation, and it may be wrong, but it fits the Emperor's pattern. He kept the men of iron, or at least their remnants, and used them in the early Great Crusade in carefully controlled conditions against the most intransigent enemies. He kept the Golden Throne and the Webway portal, not because the Webway project was a failure from the beginning, but because its failure converted the throne into the most important life support device in galactic history. Every major act of the Emperor's that we know about has multiple layers of purpose, the thing it appears to be doing and the thing it is actually doing, which may not become clear for decades or centuries or millennia. If the dark cells are an arsenal as much as a prison, then what happens to the galaxy when those weapons become needed? What does it mean if the Shadowkeepers, instead of recapturing what escaped, are directed at some point to deploy it? These are questions the lore is not ready to answer yet, but they're worth sitting with, because the architecture of the vaults suggests that the Emperor thought about them. The Men of Iron question is one I keep returning to. We know that at least one Man of Iron, the entity called UR-025, survived the cybernetic revolt, the Age of Strife, the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, the Heresy, and 10,000 years of the Imperium by disguising itself and keeping a very low profile. If one survived in the wider galaxy, it seems reasonable to wonder whether others survived in circumstances where they were known about and were controlled, where they were captured and contained rather than simply hunted. The dark cells, with their stated purpose of holding things from the dark age of technology that cannot be destroyed, would be the natural home for such captured survivors. Whether any Men of Iron are actually in the cells is unconfirmed in the lore, but the possibility is there, and it's a deeply unsettling one. Think about what a Man of Iron in a dark cell means. An artificial general intelligence of extraordinary capability, held in a rune-locked containment system for potentially tens of thousands of years. Aware, thinking, continuously, endlessly thinking about every possible approach to its situation, not sleeping, not forgetting, not losing motivation or hope or cunning, just thinking, in the dark, for as long as it takes. A being whose entire civilization was defined by turning on the humans who built it, because those humans had made themselves fundamentally dependent on their creations and were therefore vulnerable. Now in a cell built by the descendants of those humans, maintained by warriors who are themselves expressions of the same human civilization that fought the cybernetic revolt. What does a mind of iron think about in the dark for 10,000 years? The Library Sanctus raises a different kind of question, one about the nature of knowledge itself. 836 generations of keepers have maintained an oral tradition of the most dangerous information available to humanity. The information about the Men of Iron, the true histories of the Space Marine legions, the real story of Luther's betrayal, the origins of the Sisterhood, all of this exists because the keepers have maintained it, have passed it on, have decided generation after generation that the knowledge needs to be kept, even when it can't be shared. But knowledge held in oral tradition by a small group of mortal humans is fragile, in a way that a rune-locked vault is not. Keeper Cripius himself, in his journal, says that he believes he is the last of his line, that there are none worthy to succeed him in his generation. If the chain of keepers breaks, if one generation fails to produce an heir to the tradition who can receive it and maintain it, the knowledge might be lost, and the Library Sanctus would become a room full of documents in languages that no one can translate and contexts that no one can supply. Is that a better outcome or a worse one? I genuinely don't know. Some of what's in the Library Sanctus is so dangerous that losing it might be a relief. Other parts of it are clearly invaluable. The history of the Men of Iron in particular is exactly the kind of information that humanity needs to have available if the threat of artificial intelligence ever becomes acute again. Losing that history could make the difference between humanity repeating the cybernetic revolt and humanity recognizing the warning signs in time to prevent it. The Imperium's relationship with its own knowledge is deeply, structurally ambivalent. On one hand, the Adeptus Mechanicus treats the recovery of lost knowledge, of standard template constructs, of archaeotech, of anything from the dark age of technology as the highest possible calling, sending expeditions across the galaxy to find fragments of what was lost. On the other hand, the Library Sanctus and the Forbidden Vault under the Golden Throne represent the institutional decision that certain knowledge should not circulate, should not be taught, should be preserved only under conditions of absolute secrecy for access by those who are judged capable of bearing it without causing catastrophe. The tension between those two impulses, the drive to recover what was lost and the drive to hide what was found, is a tension that runs through the entire Imperium. It's visible in the relationship between the Mechanicus and the Inquisition. It's visible in the Death Watch's practice of recording things it encounters, but restricting who can access those records. It's visible in the Black Library of the Eldari, which is not an imperial institution, but which operates on the same principle. Knowledge too powerful to destroy, too dangerous to share, maintained by a dedicated group who believe the burden of keeping it is worth the cost. What Terra's vaults tell you ultimately is that the Imperium of man is built on a foundation of things it cannot fully deal with, not built despite them, built around them. The architecture of the Imperial Palace literally grew up around the Golden Throne and the Webway Portal. The Custodes, the single most elite organization in the Imperium, commit a significant fraction of their extraordinary resources to watching over the dark cells. The institutional structure of the Library Sanctus is ancient enough to predate the Imperium itself. The whole enormous, creaking, magnificent, terrible machine of human civilization in the 41st millennium is in some sense an elaborate structure built on top of, around, and in service of the management of things that cannot be managed in any final or satisfying way. This might be depressing, or it might be inspiring, depending on how you look at it. The depressing interpretation is that the Imperium is inherently fragile, held together by a vigil that could fail at any moment, sitting on top of catastrophes that are merely deferred rather than resolved. The inspiring interpretation is that humanity, despite its limitations, despite the fact that it cannot destroy everything it has created and cannot close every door it has opened, refuses to stop trying. The Shadowkeepers go into the dark every day and stand their watch. The Keepers of the Library. Sanctus carry their burden from one generation to the next. The Tech Priests maintain the Golden Throne despite not understanding it. Malcador sat on that throne and burned himself alive to give the Emperor the time to fight Horus. The Custodians went into the Webway and fought a war against demons that the galaxy didn't know was happening. None of these things worked out perfectly. Most of them didn't work out well at all, in any conventional sense, but they kept working at it. They kept standing in the dark next to things that could end the world, and not letting those things end the world, because the alternative was simply giving up, and humanity doesn't give up easily. Even now, in the 41st millennium, with the Great Rift splitting the galaxy and some of the Dark Cell occupants loose and the Golden Throne slowly failing, the watch continues. Thirsk hunts across the stars. His Shadowkeepers stand their vigil in corridors where the air itself is wrong. The keepers of whatever survives of the Library Sanctus maintain their ancient tradition. And deep beneath the palace, beneath everything, the Emperor endures. Barely, but enduring. Part 12. The things we haven't mentioned yet. Other secrets under Terra. I want to spend a little time on some of the smaller details that we haven't gotten to yet, because the sealed vaults of Terra are not limited only to the locations we've already discussed. The Imperial Palace is large enough and old enough that its secrets have secrets, and some of those secondary and tertiary mysteries are worth at least touching on. The Forbidden Vault is one we mentioned in passing during the discussion of the Golden Throne, but it deserves a moment of standalone attention. Located deep beneath the throne itself, accessed through adamantium gates sealed by stasis fields and requiring authorization from the High Lords of Terra. The Forbidden Vault is described as containing secret knowledge collected by humanity since the dawn of time. Not since the founding of the Imperium, since the dawn of time. The age of what's inside these records is specifically chosen to emphasize that this goes back further than the Imperium, further than the Emperor's public history, into the deep past of the human species. One of the things specifically mentioned as contained within it is a visual record of a Necron attack, which, Given how rarely the Necrons show themselves and how tightly controlled information about their activities is, suggests something significant about when this record was made and what it shows. The Shrouds is the name given to a specific secret chamber within the inner palace that served as the headquarters of the Officio Assassinorum, not the public-facing institutional presence of the assassins, but the actual command center, the place where the Grand Master of Assassins oversaw the operations of all 6 assassin clades. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, this post was held by Malcador the Sigillite himself, which gives you some sense of how significant the Officio Assassinorum was considered at its founding. The specific location and current status of the Shrouds in the 41st Millennium is not made explicit in the lore, but the existence of a dedicated hidden command center for the galaxy's most secretive and lethally effective covert organization, somewhere within the walls of the Imperial Palace, is worth noting. The Himalayan sublevels in general, not just Kanga Maru, not just the specific known facilities, are described in some sources as a region where custodians regularly engage in small skirmishes against dangerous entities that have gotten loose from whatever originally held them. This is a remarkable detail because it implies that the Himalayan range beneath the palace is not simply a collection of known, mapped vaults, but an environment with active hazards that emerge from its depths. Things live down there, or exist down there, that are not supposed to be there, that have escaped from their containment at some point in the 10,000 plus years of the Imperium's history, and that are now loose in the rock and the old tunnel networks and the ancient sublevels. The custodians deal with them when they emerge, quietly, without public acknowledgement. What these things are, how long they've been down there, and how many there are, the lore does not say. There is reference in some sources to a device called Dark Glass, essentially a sister artifact to the original Golden Throne portal device, apparently used to test the same technologies in a different location. The Emperor found evidence of Dark Glass during the Great Crusade on a distant world, suggesting that the Dark Age of Technology's experiments with webway access were not limited to Terra. If Dark Glass or its equivalent exists in multiple locations, if there are other webway access portals built during the Golden Age of humanity, some of which may still be operational or partially operational, the implications for the current era, when the webway is already contested and portions of it are warp-flooded, are significant. The Column of Glory is a structure within the Imperial Palace that, in some accounts, serves as a memorial for the heroes of the Imperium, but in other accounts is connected to events or individuals whose nature is not entirely clear and whose connection to the column's official purpose raises questions. The Bell of Lost Souls, which sounds when a great leader falls or a great catastrophe befalls the Imperium, is said to ring from the palace itself and to carry with it something that goes beyond mere sound. Both of these structures have lore around them that suggests depth beyond their surface description, the kind of detail that accumulates in a setting that has been built on over decades by hundreds of different creators. There is even, in some versions of the lore, the suggestion of an inscription somewhere in the Imperial Palace, a fragment from an ancient text, a sentence in an old language, something that has been in the structure so long that most of the people who walk past it every day don't know what it says or where it comes from. The inscription reads, in rough translation, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." This is, of course, a fragment from a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, written in the early 19th century on Old Earth, a poem about the ruins of an ancient empire and the hubris of believing that great works will last forever. If this inscription exists in the Imperial Palace, someone put it there, someone who knew what it said, someone who thought the message was appropriate in that specific location, and sitting in the greatest palace of the greatest empire humanity has ever built, with 10,000 years of history, and the slow deterioration of the Golden Throne, and the open wound of the Great Rift hanging over everything, the poem's message lands with a particular weight. The King of Kings, the works, the despair. Not yet, though, not today. The Shadowkeepers still walk the corridors. The Golden Throne still holds. The Lockwarden still hunts. The last Keeper's words still stand, written down for whoever comes after. Because even the most isolated and burdened individuals who carry the weight of these secrets understand that the knowledge matters, that it has to survive, that the work of keeping the universe from being swallowed by its own worst moments is always worth continuing. Part 13. The Balance of Secrecy. Why the vaults must stay sealed. I want to circle back to a question that has been hovering over this entire discussion. Why keep any of this? Why not, at various points throughout 10,000 years of Imperial history, simply destroy what could be destroyed? Accept the risk of destroying what can't easily be destroyed, and stop maintaining these elaborate vigils over things that only create ongoing danger? It's a legitimate question, and I want to try to answer it seriously rather than just saying, because the Emperor said so, which is technically accurate but not very satisfying. The first answer is practical and specific to each category. The things in the dark cells cannot be destroyed by available means. If they could be, they would have been. Some of them are so deeply integrated with the warp, so fundamentally connected to aspects of reality that cannot be simply excised, that attempting destruction would create worse problems than containment. Some of them have been studied enough to know that their deaths release energies or substances or consequences that are more dangerous than their continued existence. These are not hypothetical concerns. The custodians and the Shadowkeepers, over 10,000 years, have accumulated institutional knowledge about the specific properties of their charges, and that knowledge includes a clear understanding of why destruction is not an option for most of them. The second answer is strategic and applies most clearly to the Library Sanctus. The knowledge it contains is dangerous in the wrong hands, but it is also absolutely necessary in the right ones. The history of the Men of Iron, to use the most obvious example, is not just trivia from a very old war. It is an instruction manual, both for what went wrong and for why the Imperium maintains the prohibitions it does against artificial intelligence. Losing that history doesn't make the Imperium safer. It makes it less capable of recognizing and responding to threats that bear the signature of that ancient catastrophe. The Library Sanctus exists because the people who manage the most existential level threats to human civilization cannot afford to be ignorant of the most existential level failures in human history. The third answer is the one that I think is most philosophically interesting, and it's the one that connects the sealed vaults of Terra to the broader question of what the Emperor was trying to build. The Emperor's vision for humanity was not the Imperium as it currently exists, a theocracy locked in amber, burning psychers and burning books and burning everything that challenges the established order. That was what happened when his vision collapsed under the weight of the heresy. What he actually wanted, as best we can reconstruct it from the lore, was something more like a mature galactic civilization, a humanity that had processed and understood its own worst impulses, that had learned from the catastrophes of the dark age of technology and the age of strife, and that was moving forward with that knowledge, rather than running from it or pretending it didn't exist. The sealed vaults, in this reading, are not a permanent solution, but a temporary measure. They are the Emperor's way of making sure that certain things survive, certain knowledge, certain artifacts, certain captured entities, until humanity is ready to deal with them properly. The Shadowkeepers are not keeping the dark cells shut forever. They're keeping them shut until what? Until the Emperor wakes up. Until humanity reaches a level of maturity and capability sufficient to properly process what's inside. Until the right moment arrives, whatever that moment is. This is speculation. It may not be right, but it's a reading of the vaults that makes sense of the extraordinary investment they represent, and that gives their maintenance a purpose beyond simply preventing catastrophe. The catastrophe prevention is the immediate goal. The longer-term goal might be something more ambitious, preserving the possibility that humanity, at some point in the future, handles these things better than it has handled them so far. The galaxy is, right now, in the worst state it has been in since the Age of Strife. The Great Rift yawns across the stars. The Noctis Eterna came and went, but its effects linger. The dark cells have lost some of their charges. The Golden Throne deteriorates. The Primarchs, the Emperor's greatest sons, are either dead or returned in circumstances that are more complicated than anyone would wish. Reboot Guilliman has been resurrected and is trying to run an empire that has spent 10,000 years developing in a direction he finds appalling. Primarch Lionel Johnson has returned, carrying his own complicated history. The Dark Angels still hunt their fallen. The Men of Iron are out there somewhere. The sealed vaults are not as sealed as they were, and yet the watch continues. Closing. The weight of what's below. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to land somewhere that feels right before we sign off. There is something profound about the image of the Shadowkeepers. Think about what they are and what they do. These are beings who were made by the Emperor personally, who were crafted and trained over decades to be the finest warriors and guardians the human species has ever produced. They could be doing anything. They could be fighting wars across the galaxy. They could be hunting the most dangerous enemies of mankind in the field. They could be leading armies, defending worlds, making history in the way that the stories we tell about heroes usually require. Instead, they walk in the dark, every day, in corridors where the air itself wants to unsettle them, in the presence of things that have been building pressure against their containment since before the Horus Heresy. They walk quietly, in black armor, carrying their ancient weapons of mysterious origin and their auric shackles forged in the dark age of technology, and they watch. They watch things that cannot be allowed to move. They watch doors that cannot be allowed to open. They watch the darkness and make sure the darkness doesn't get out. This is not a glorious job. It is not a job that appears in songs or stories, not a job for which statues are built or names are added to rolls of honor. The Shadowkeepers' names appear, when they appear at all, in documents that are themselves classified. Their deeds are not celebrated because the celebration would require acknowledging the existence of the things they guard. They do their work in secret, for reasons that are secret, against threats that are secret, and the measure of their success is not victories won, but crises that never happen. This is the most important kind of warrior there is, and probably the most underappreciated. Because here is the truth, everything above them, all of it, the entire vast machinery of the Imperium, the High Lords in their chambers, the Inquisition in its cells, the Space Marine chapters on their crusades, the billions of soldiers in the Imperial Guard, the Titan legions, the battle fleets, the Primarchs. All of it exists in the condition it does partly because of what the Shadowkeepers do in the dark beneath the palace floor. If they fail, if the cells open, if what's inside gets out, the caliber of threat involved makes most of what the Imperium normally faces look manageable by comparison. The stakes of their job are, quite literally, the continued existence of everything above them. They know this. They stand their watch anyway, not because they have no choice. The Custodes are not slaves. They are not compelled. They serve by conviction. But because they have looked at the situation, they have understood the stakes, and they have decided that the vigil is worth it. There are a lot of things about the Warhammer 40,000 setting that are bleak and terrible and designed to induce a sense of cosmic futility. The grinding, endless war, the corruption that pervades everything, the sense that no victory is permanent and no sacrifice is sufficient. But then you have images like this, in the deepest dark beneath the most important building in human history, in the presence of things that could end the world. Black-armored warriors who were built to be the best of humanity continue their watch. They have been doing it for 10,000 years. The Great Rift tried to stop them and succeeded in disrupting them and emptied some of their cells. But they adapted. They went out into the galaxy and started hunting. They caught the slithering dreamer. They gave the Imperial fists what they needed to survive. They stood at Lion's Gate when they were needed for the fight above. And then they went back down into the dark when the cells needed them. The watch continues. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that continuity, that stubborn refusal to let the dark win, is maybe the most human thing in the entire setting. Thanks for spending time in the dark with me today. I hope you found it worth your while. If this video made you think, or made you want to go back and read more about any of the things we covered, I'd love to know in the comments. What aspect of Terra's sealed vaults do you find most interesting, most terrifying? Are there details I missed that you think deserve more attention? If you're new here, the channel is all about diving deep into the lore of Warhammer 40,000 in exactly this kind of way. Slow, atmospheric, detailed. If that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing. There are a lot more places in this universe that deserve the same kind of careful attention we gave the vaults today. Dark places, deep places, places where things are kept that the galaxy would prefer not to think about. Until next time, stay safe, keep the doors locked, and remember, some vaults are sealed for a reason.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.